River valley settlements became city-states. City-states became empires. The Mesopotamian empires that had dominated ancient times dissolved into the Persian and eventually Macedonian Empire, spreading Greek culture around the Mediterranean world. The Romans eventually surpassed the Greeks, and thus Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa would be united from around 500 BCE to around 500 CE. Stability! Yay! But did women live and thrive in these empires? Were any opposed to these empires? Aw, heck yes. And a few even took to war to defend their homeland. In this episode, we are going to focus on the Roman Empire, but tune in later for women in the Han Empire. Welcome to Remedial Herstory, where we ask what happened to the women and put them in. In this series, we tell women's history from era to era from the perspectives of differing and diverse women. Women are half of history. Welcome to Herstory. Roman culture built on the Greek culture that had preceded and paralleled it. Its polytheistic religious beliefs accounted for the renaming of most of the Greek gods into Roman equivalents. It adopted most of the Greek ideas about medicine, philosophy, and culture, as well as a woman's place. Check out episode 5, 800 to 400 BCE, Founding Myths and Women's Place, to learn more about these. But the Romans developed their own ideas. As Rome expanded, it increasingly became a warrior society where masculinity was strictly defined and men were measured on their successes as soldiers and property owners, which included women. In their private lives, this meant absolute control over their wives, children, and slaves. Absolute control means exactly what that sounds like, including the right to kill them without interference from anyone, not even the government. Absolute freedom became a part of the male identity. As the empire expanded and government control seeped into people's personal lives, so did the life and death power of the male head of household. Women participated in this warrior culture by raising brave sons and passing on the values of the warrior state to their children. Roman mothers were known to tell their sons off to war, "Return with your shield or on it." Yikes! The endless conquests of the Roman Empire also meant that hundreds of thousands of women and men were brought into the empire as slaves. Female slaves did domestic work, worked in brothels, were dancers, actresses, and were sometimes used for sex by their male owners. Slavery was deeply embedded in the culture of Rome, many viewing it as punishment from the gods or God. Despite the persistent beliefs that women should not be educated, upper-class Roman women capitalized on the need to build strong and educated warriors to justify their own educations as mothers and future wives of military leaders. But this was a little scary for some families who especially were very wealthy. In order to protect family fortunes, elite women were sometimes married off without transferring legal control to their husbands. This allowed them to manage their own fortunes. Imagine that. However, more often, legal control just remained with their father or previous male guardian. During the reign of Augustus, he passed a law that stated freeborn women who bore 3 or more children were free from guardianship. Otherwise, women were under the control of a man. Little changed for the average woman in regard to her contribution to the public sphere and intellectual prospects. Women were educated enough to serve the home and rear their children. Male contemporaries remained staunchly opposed to women's education. Given that wealth in Rome led to greater male education, there is significant evidence to suggest that the ratio of literate women actually declined. Titus Livy, one of the first Roman historians, stated, "A woman's mind is influenced by little things." Publius Syrus said, "A woman who meditates alone meditates evil." Another wrote his misogyny in a poem. But out of all plagues, the greatest is untold, the book-learned wife, in Greek and Latin bold. If the scholars of the era held such hostile views of women thinking, let alone writing, there was little possibility of mainstream training, recognition, and archiving of female achievements. Yet we still know a lot about women of this period, notably the most elite of the elite women. Their power or proximity to power meant that their lives and stories would be recorded. Across the Mediterranean from Rome, one of the most famous female rulers came to power, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was not Roman. She was the last leader of Egypt. But her reign had a huge influence on Rome and is seen as a crucial part of the transition of Rome into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra was trying to keep Egypt in play as a major world power in the wake of the crushing Roman Republic, and both internal and external threats. In 51 BCE, the Egyptian throne passed to 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy VIII. As all too common in politics, her brother's advisors soon painted her as a political threat, and she was forced to flee to Syria. Refusing to see her power stripped away, she raised an army of mercenaries and returned the following year to face her brother's forces in a civil war. She was not only financing the war, but she also made sure to have a presence on the battlefield. She used all the weapons at her disposal, including her political guile. When Julius Caesar came to Alexandria, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into his headquarters to ask for his support in the war against her brother. Finding mutually beneficial ground, power for her, money for him, they eventually united against her brother and successfully overthrew him. She also gave birth to Caesar's son. Cleopatra would maintain a long, strained relationship with Caesar in Rome. But after Caesar's assassination, she saw herself potentially in the crosshairs of the new Roman Empire. In her time as pharaoh, she worked to gain the respect of the people for herself and her son, even identifying herself as a vessel of the goddess Isis, which was typical of Egyptian royalty trying to secure their power. However, internal strife always followed Cleopatra. Her younger sister, Arsinoe, who had been exiled, was looking to dethrone Cleopatra. And, seeking additional security, Cleopatra found herself in a political and romantic alliance with Mark Antony, her ultimate undoing. In her first formal meeting with the general, Plutarch wrote, "She brought with her her surest hopes in her own magic arts and charms." Antony was in his own power struggle with Julius Caesar's designated successor, his nephew, Octavian, the eventual Augustus. The struggle was over the control of the Roman Empire, which had been divided into 3 sections. In an attempt to secure peace, Octavian's younger sister, Octavia, had been married to Antony. The marriage was initially successful, but tensions mounted, and Antony and Octavian were soon at war. In 36 BCE, Antony left home to command troops in Parthia, resuming his alliance and romantic liaison with Cleopatra. Octavia was a good and decent wife who, despite his complete betrayal and infidelity, brought him troops and money. When she arrived, he refused her, and 3 years later, she obtained a divorce. Cleopatra brought her ships and soldiers to aid Antony in the Battle of Antium in 31 BCE. But they lost, and she and Antony fled back to Alexandria, only to be cornered. Both famously committed suicide, and their bodies were paraded through Rome. Despite being mother to Julius Caesar's son, Cleopatra was labeled as a seductress by Roman historians due to her relationships, and while these relationships were undoubtedly romantic in nature, she used the opportunity to protect her power. Cleopatra stood toe-to-toe with some of the most famous figures in the classical world. Further south, another female African monarch prepared to face Rome and cease their expansion southward. And, unlike Cleopatra, she would succeed. Sort of. Romans began incursions south toward the empire of Kush. So the Kushites planned preemptive attacks on Roman-held cities in southern Egypt and were initially successful, but their king died in battle. Back home, the queen Kandake, meaning great woman, Amenorreus, and her son again led the Kushites north to engage the Romans. Romans responded by leading 10,000 soldiers southward. The result was basically a stalemate. By succeeding in the negotiations, Kandake Amenorreus spared her people domination, like a badass boss woman of the ancient world. Back in Rome, Cleopatra's defeat and continued Roman expansion would lead to wealth and a long line of powerful empresses. Octavian was surrounded by powerful women who defined and navigated the political leadership like a boss, although a lot of them ended up, tragically, dead. Octavian's wife, Scibonia, gave him his only child, a daughter, Julia. Creative. When she was only a few days old, apparently Augustus fell in love with Livia Drusilla on sight, and they both promptly divorced their spouses. As Empress Consort, Livia was active in politics and governed her own affairs. She pushed him towards making his heir Tiberius, Livia's son from her first marriage. Augustus forced him to divorce his wife and instead marry his daughter Julia, her second political marriage already, and a marriage neither wanted. Julia already had 2 daughters, another Julia and Agrippa the Elder. When Julia and Tiberius's only child died in infancy, any semblances of happiness they had was gone. Julia was left alone in Rome, where by many accounts she lived a pretty promiscuous life. Roman author Macrobius claimed that she was a witty, intelligent woman and was loved by the people, but her sexual activity led Augustus to exile her as a, quote, disease in my flesh. She died from malnutrition on a random island because, as we know, promiscuity by women is never tolerated. Augustus gave his wife Livia the title Augusta, which meant that she would maintain her title after he died. He left her 1/3 of his estates, which is a lot. Her son Tiberius found her power difficult to maneuver around, an influence she had maintained through political allies. But Tiberius's rule was problematic for other reasons. Mostly Julia the Elder's daughters were wreaking havoc on his legitimacy. Agrippa the Elder accused him of murdering her husband, whom she had 9 children with. So many children. When Tiberius's son died, hers came into the line of succession. So she and her older sons were exiled and died. Yikes. It's a wonder all these exiles didn't band together and start their own civilization. Her remaining son became Tiberius's successor, Emperor Caligula, and 3 daughters were able to survive. Caligula was, by all accounts, a terrible ruler. So his sister Julia, yes, the 3rd one, and Agrippa the Younger plotted to kill him. Agrippa was exiled for a bit, but when Caligula was finally murdered, her uncle and 3rd husband, Claudius, brought her back to Rome. Agrippa was labeled by historians as the first true empress of Rome. Claudius was Livia's grandson. His 3rd wife was executed for having an affair with a senator, so Agrippa the Younger needed to navigate her path cautiously, and by all accounts, she did. He elevated her title to the one his grandmother had had, Augusta, and elevated Livia to deity status. According to some sources, Claudius was sickly, weak, and not suited for imperial life, although by the standards of his successors, he did a pretty okay job. Despite being an empress consort, Agrippa wanted to exercise real power. She was visible in politics and sat next to Claudius in occasions of state. For 5 years, there was prosperity, but Roman historians tell us Agrippa wanted even more influence, so she murdered Claudius and installed her infamous son, Nero. Good prospects, 0. Gold coins from right after Nero became emperor show him nose to nose with his mom, with the title Wife of the Deified Claudius, Mother of Nero Caesar. But Roman historians who recorded his legacy sought to paint him as the epitome of corrupt, debaucherous, and evil ruler. In doing so, they told the stories of his violence against women. It's hard to know what is true and what is not, because the authors of these texts were blatantly biased against him. According to later Roman historians, he and his mother were sometimes lovers. Ew. In order to solidify his rule, he had her killed because she was too powerful, and senators were teasing him for being ruled by a woman, and his manhood was threatened. A little bit of ancient toxic masculinity, anyone? Roman historian Tacitus alleged that Agrippa was so desperate for power after murdering her husband that she seduced her own son. Regardless of the likely exaggerations, Nero did order his mother killed. Later, Nero apparently had his first wife and stepsister, Claudia Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, banished, bound, and stabbed before suffocating her in a hot bath. He then murdered his second wife, Poppaea Sabina, by kicking her pregnant belly. But a lot of this probably tells us more about the historians than Nero and his wives. It is interesting, though, that ill treatment of women was used to demonstrate the evil nature of a ruler, which perhaps suggests that treating your women well was to be admired. Although Nero is remembered for killing Christians, intentionally burning Rome, and other ridiculous things, a lot of evidence shows that Nero was not hugely unpopular with the people. He clashed with the Senate and the wealthy elites because they wanted to maintain their wealth. But the Roman Empire was huge and could no longer be governed like a city-state. Taxes had to be raised and soldiers sent to defend far-off lands. The government had difficulty defending its vast territory from the barbarian tribes moving into Roman lands. In 60 CE, Common Era, half a world away, the Iceni queen on the island of Britain, Buddica, took up the mantle of warrior for her people, a woman who makes Xena, warrior princess, look like a pacifist. The Iceni had once welcomed the Romans, seeing them as a powerful and potentially beneficial ally during the early expeditions by Caesar. However, in the later colonial efforts, the Roman made enemies among the Britannia tribes, including those who had offered alliances to Caesar in the years before by forcing economic and political arrangements that only benefited Rome. Increased oppression over the years would lead to a number of rebellions, large and small, but none created such fear as Buddica's. When her husband died, he left behind a will that named the Roman emperor co-heir with his 2 teenage daughters. His hope had been that this would protect his people by maintaining some of their power, but also please Rome by giving them a piece of it as well. However, Rome had no interest in obeying the will of a dead king, and claimed the entirety of the tribe's lands as their own. Soon, the Romans showed up to take their lands, and when Buddica objected, she was mercilessly flogged in front of her people. Far worse, her daughters, heirs to the throne, were dragged in front of her and raped. Buddica rose up and avenged her own family as well as her tribal family. She gained support from surrounding tribes who band together to free themselves from the Roman menace. Some argued that she used false omens and potentially even witchcraft to convince others to follow her, though that comes mainly from Roman historians. The invention of conspiracy theories, perhaps. Thanks a lot, Romans. Soon, she led her united tribal armies against Roman colonial towns. Brutality was clearly not just a Roman tactic, as her armies were known to brutalize the population, even burning down a Roman temple with hundreds inside. Her pattern of success seemed marked by a blaze of glory as she destroyed multiple Roman and Roman allied towns, to the point that Roman officials had no choice but to attack. 10,000 Romans confronted Buddica and her people at an unknown location. When they met, she supposedly had an army of 230,000. But it's quite clear that this is an example of inflation to make Rome's military look unbelievably superior. It's very likely that Buddica had a larger force, but many of her forces would have been untrained or ill-equipped compared to the professional Roman forces. Still, it's said that Buddica's forces consisted of men and women, young and old, following her and her daughter's carriage into battle. According to Tacitus, she rode in front of her people on a chariot with her daughters, avenging not as a queen of glorious ancestry, her tarnished realm and power, but as a woman of the people, her liberty lost, her body tortured by the flesh, the tarnished honor of her daughters. The Roman cupidity had progressed so far that not their very persons, not the age itself, nor maidenhood were left unpolluted. Unfortunately, her forces would be routed by the Roman legionaries, and Buddica, like Cleopatra, would choose suicide over capture. She still remains a symbol of freedom, unity, and courage in British culture. Her statue stands ironically in the very city she burned down, London. Buddica would not be the only leader to challenge Rome. Zenobia was queen of the Palmyrene Empire, formed as a breakaway kingdom from the Roman Empire amid power struggles in the 3rd century CE. Unlike Buddica, who charged at Rome headfirst, Zenobia cleverly played loyal and constructed an expansive empire right under their nose, until her power could no longer be ignored. Born into a Roman province, Zenobia was a Roman citizen and possibly had ties to prominent historic Roman families. However, she would proclaim that she was a descendant of Hellenistic royalty, including Cleopatra and Dido. Long before she came to power, she played a principal role at her family farm, where Arabic histories indicate she developed her characteristic stamina, equestrian skills, and experience in leading men. When Zenobia's husband marched against the Persians and reinstated Roman rule, he was rewarded with governorship of the whole eastern portion of the empire. He became more and more powerful, seen as more of an authority in the region than Rome itself. However, in 266, he was assassinated by his nephew after a dispute following a hunting trip. Some ancient historians hinted that Zenobia herself was behind the assassination. Because his son with Zenobia was still a child, she ruled in his place as regent. Palmyra was a solid relationship with Rome at the time, and her husband was considered a possible successor for the emperor. Initially, Zenobia saw the same potential for herself and her son, but as the chaos of the 3rd century continued, she decided not to wait to build her empire. In 269 CE, she sent her army into the Roman Egypt and claimed it as her own, but cleverly did so under the guise of putting down a local revolt, and thereby looking like she was doing so in favor of Rome. Contemporary historians contend that she had sent instigators in herself. She not only gained control of Egypt, but soon the areas of Levant and parts of Asia Minor, all while proclaiming to be loyal to Rome. Only 5 years into her rule as regent and 2 years after her conquest of Egypt, she created an empire that began to rival the 2 major powers to either side of her. The Palmyrene Empire quickly wedged its way between Rome and Persian empires, both of whom had long oppressed the people of the region and saw Zenobia's empire as favorable alternative, and neither of whom seemed to even realize what she was doing. However, she couldn't fly under the radar for long. When Aurelian became emperor, he was a military man who was intent on bringing order back to Rome through force. He soon turned on Zenobia's blooming empire in 272 CE, destroying everything in his path once he crossed her border. Cities soon surrendered to him before he even reached them to ensure their safety. Zenobia, too, tried to reach the emperor to assure him of her questionable loyalty, but he remained silent. Not really sure what was going on, she raised her army in preparation for battle. Unfortunately for the warrior queen, Aurelian's forces would slaughter hers. Zenobia had to retreat, and though defeated, this is not to say her and her people didn't put up quite a fight in the process. The historian Augusta indicates that Aurelian wrote,
"It cannot be told what a store of arrows is here, what great preparations for war, what a store of spears and of stones. There is no section of the wall that is not held by 2 or 3 engines of war, and their machines can even hurl fire. Why say more? She fears like a woman, and fights as one who fears punishment. I believe, however, that the gods will truly bring aid to the Roman Commonwealth, for they have never failed our endeavors."
She and her son, after one more attempt at a stand near the capital, fled towards Persia. The skilled equestrian had outpaced his pursuing cavalry for some time, but was ultimately caught trying to cross the Euphrates River and was brought back home. Her fate is questionable. Some historians have claimed she was paraded through the capital city as many prisoners had been, chained and publicly shamed. Some proclaim that she died along the way to Rome, varying from being executed or maybe committing suicide to evade capture. Others say that she was put on trial in Rome, but was ultimately acquitted when claiming she was innocent and simply misled by her advisors. Others say that she was not only acquitted, but actually married a prominent Roman and had a daughter who was later married to Aurelian himself. Get it straight, antiquity! While she may or may not have met an end fitting for the warrior queen that she was, Zenobia, like the other leading women of the ancient world, had proven her ability to weather the hardships and consequences of war. Historians describe her as a leader who worked her soldiers hard and could outhunt and outdrink any one of them. More modern historians have analyzed that she deftly used her stereotypes of both gender and methods of building her empire, and possibly in her trial after the fact, if that ever happened, allowing the men around her to assume that she was weaker or more naive than she truly was. In doing so, she created a powerful army and empire that, while short-lived, was one of her own creation, and her authority became a primary target of the greatest empire of the ancient world. Zenobia became one of the most iconic, though underappreciated figures of the ancient world. Let's reinstall her in her proper, impressive place. Inside and outside the Roman Empire, women existed and participated in the issues of the time. Women labored in the domestic sphere as homemakers and mothers, in markets, as prostitutes, slaves, and jockeyed for power. Women also played prominent roles in securing and challenging the empire. These women rose to power amid the restrictions and expectations of their societies. While these outliers are known, many thousands of female leaders have been lost to time. In many ways, the Han Empire was similar to the Roman Empire. Compare and contrast these empires with episode number 8, 100 BCE to 100 CE, Women and the Han Empire. What more can we learn about these women? How did the layers of class and region change their experiences? What lessons do their stories hold for female leadership in the centuries to come? Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into these questions and form your own conclusions, go to our website, remedialherstory.com, where you can find free, ready-made lesson plans, primary documents, recommended films and readings, and more.